Hey guys, tonight we are going to do something unusually relaxing with a topic that was, for the people involved, not especially relaxing at all. We are going to wander slowly through one of history's most famous disappearances, or rather, one of history's most misunderstood non-disappearances. The Great Maya collapse sounds dramatic, clean, and sudden, as if an entire civilization packed one bag, sighed heavily, and vanished into the jungle before breakfast. But history is almost never that tidy. Civilizations do not usually explode like glass. They fray, they shift, they move their furniture around, they argue with the weather, they make decisions that seem sensible at the time and less sensible in hindsight. And then, centuries later, people look back and say, well, that seems to have gone poorly. So, as we settle in tonight, and yes, remember to quietly subscribe if you enjoy sleepy history, let us take a calm and drowsy look at what really happened to the ancient Maya, who they were, what exactly collapsed, and why the story is more complicated than a single catastrophe under a blazing tropical sun. To begin with, the Maya were not a single king, a single city, or a single empire in the way people often imagine. They were a network of city-states spread across what is now southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and parts of Honduras and El Salvador. If you picture a neat empire with one capital and one ruler giving stern speeches from a central palace, you may gently set that picture aside. The Maya world was more like a competitive neighborhood of powerful cities, each with its own ruler, its own dynastic pride, its own scribes, priests, nobles, merchants, builders, farmers, and probably its own opinion about how unbearable the neighbors were. Some cities became strong for a time, then weakened. Others rose later. Alliances formed, alliances broke. Royal marriages tried to patch things up. Wars ruined the mood again. It was political, dynamic, and, for the average person, likely exhausting. The period people usually mean when they talk about the Great Maya collapse is the decline of many southern lowland cities during the 9th century, especially between around 750 and 900 CE. This is important because the Maya civilization itself did not simply end. Maya people survived. Maya communities survived. Maya languages survived. In fact, millions of Maya descendants still live today. What collapsed was not a people, but a particular political and cultural order centered on monumental southern lowland cities, royal courts, and the system that supported them. This is a bit less dramatic than a vanishing civilization, but much more accurate, which is the sort of thing historians enjoy almost as much as everyone else enjoys not being corrected. At their height, Maya cities could be astonishing places. Rising above the forest were temple pyramids, palaces, plazas, causeways, ball courts, reservoirs, and carved stone monuments. These monuments, called stelae, were covered in inscriptions recording royal births, accessions, victories, rituals, and various reminders that the local king was excellent and favored by cosmic order. Maya scribes developed one of the most sophisticated writing systems in the ancient Americas. Their astronomers tracked celestial cycles with remarkable precision. Their architects built ceremonial centers that still inspire awe, even when partially wrapped in roots and vines, which, to be fair, improves the atmosphere. It was a world of ceremony, calculation, dynastic ambition, and hard agricultural labor. The beauty of the temples tended to depend on an enormous amount of ordinary people growing food, hauling stone, paying tribute, and not getting much credit in the inscriptions. And that is one of the first things to keep in mind. When we talk about a collapse, we are usually seeing the breakdown first through the eyes of elite culture. The stone inscriptions stop. Monument construction declines. Palaces are abandoned. Royal dynasties disappear from the record. That is what archaeologists notice because kings were very good at building things that lasted and very bad at imagining future graduate students with notebooks. But while elite collapse is dramatic, the lives of farmers, laborers, and villagers could continue in altered form. Some people moved to smaller settlements. Some reorganized their economies. Some shifted toward regions that were still viable. The end of a royal court did not necessarily mean the end of daily life. It meant that one political arrangement had stopped functioning. For the king, this was a catastrophe. For a maize farmer already carrying taxes, labor obligations, and the burden of some ruler's pyramid project, it may have looked more like the latest in a long series of unwelcome adjustments. So why did those great southern cities decline? Historians and archaeologists have spent decades arguing, testing, excavating, comparing climate records, reading inscriptions, and generally having a very scholarly disagreement about exactly how many problems hit at once. The short answer is that there was probably no single cause. The long answer, which we're here to enjoy very slowly, is that the collapse seems to have come from the interaction of several pressures: warfare, political instability, environmental strain, drought, overpopulation in some regions, weakened legitimacy of rulers, and disruptions to trade and food systems. In other words, it was the ancient equivalent of everything going wrong together, which remains one of humanity's least charming traditions. Let us start with the landscape, because geography shaped Maya life from the beginning. The Maya occupied diverse environments, from volcanic highlands to dense tropical forests to drier northern plains. In the southern lowlands, where many famous classic Maya cities flourished, the environment was both rich and difficult. The forests were productive, but the soils were often thin or variable. Rivers were not always available where people might have preferred them. In some regions, seasonal rainfall mattered enormously, and storing water was not just useful, but essential. Cities created reservoirs, terraces, and other systems to manage water and agriculture. These were impressive achievements, but they also meant the urban system depended on careful maintenance and fairly reliable rainfall. It was not the kind of place where one wanted the climate to become moody for several decades. Unfortunately, evidence from lake sediments, cave formations, and other climate records suggests that the Maya lowlands experienced repeated droughts, including severe drought episodes during the late Classic and Terminal Classic periods. Now, drought alone does not automatically end a civilization. Human societies are annoyingly resilient, right up until the moment they are not. But prolonged or repeated drought can be devastating when populations are dense, agriculture is stretched, political legitimacy is tied to ritual power, and rulers are expected to keep the cosmos, the crops, and the tax system all functioning at once. If the rains fail, the maize suffers. If the maize suffers, people suffer. If people suffer long enough, they begin to wonder whether the ruler who claims to mediate between gods and humans is perhaps not performing especially well. This brings us to Maya kingship, which was not merely political, but sacred. Rulers were expected to perform rituals, communicate with ancestors and deities, wage victorious wars, sponsor ceremonies, and maintain social order. Their authority was wrapped in cosmic symbolism. This worked beautifully when the harvests were decent and the monuments were going up on schedule. It worked less well when environmental stress, food shortages, and war made life grim. If elites continued demanding labor for palaces and temples while ordinary people were struggling to eat, resentment may have grown. Archaeology cannot always show us feelings, sadly, because ancient people rarely left a clay tablet reading, "Frankly, I've had enough." But social tension is a very plausible factor. Systems built on divine prestige can lose that prestige quickly when the divine results fail to arrive. Warfare also seems to have intensified during the period leading up to the collapse. Earlier generations of scholars once imagined the classic Maya as peaceful astronomer priests who spent their days contemplating Venus and being serene in architecture. Later, evidence ruined this very restful fantasy. Inscriptions, fortifications, defensive earthworks, weapon injuries, and depictions of captives all show that Maya politics could be violently competitive. Cities fought each other. Dynasties were overthrown. Alliances shifted. Prestige depended in part on military success. Captured nobles were humiliated, sacrificed, or displayed. It was not exactly a wellness retreat. As competition increased, warfare may have become more destructive and more frequent. That matters because city-states in a tightly connected political world do not fail in isolation. If one major center is destabilized, its trade partners, allies, dependents, and rivals are affected. A defeated king may be replaced. A vassal city may rebel. A marriage alliance may collapse. Trade routes may become unsafe. Refugees may move. Military spending, in the ancient sense of mobilizing labor and resources, may burden a population already under stress. The more unstable the network becomes, the harder it is for any one city to recover calmly. Imagine a neighborhood where every household is running low on food, the water supply is uncertain, and the homeowners association has decided this is the ideal moment for a knife fight. One begins to see how things might deteriorate. History filed the paperwork much later. The people living through it, meanwhile, still had to decide where breakfast would come from, whether the water was clean enough to drink without regretting it, and whether the road to the next market town was still safe this season. That is one of the quietly important things about the Great Maya collapse. It was enormous in historical scale, but intimate in lived experience. A royal dynasty could fail in a way that looks grand on a monument. A household experienced that same failure as a thinner maize store, a missed exchange, a cousin leaving with his family, or another demand from local elites who seemed determined to remain expensive even as everything else was becoming less reliable. And so, if we are going to follow the story properly into its second half, we should slow down even more and ask not only how cities decline, but what the world looked like after the old confidence had started to leak out of it. Imagine a once busy ceremonial center after its political life has begun to contract. The great plaza is still there, obviously. Stone has a stubborn personality. The temple still throws a long shadow in the late afternoon. The carved monuments are still upright, though perhaps weathering at the edges, their proud dates and victories now receiving far less attention from anyone with practical chores to do. Perhaps one or two noble compounds remain occupied. Perhaps a few ritual specialists still tend certain shrines. But the city's rhythm is different now. The ceremonial calendar may still exist, but it no longer coordinates the movement of a vast and confident population. The market is smaller. The labor gangs are fewer. The builders have stopped arriving with new stone. And the city, which once seemed like the center of all meaningful order, has started to feel slightly overbuilt for the number of people still willing to pretend it is thriving. This is where abandonment becomes an interesting word, because abandoned places are rarely abandoned all at once. A palace may be empty while nearby households continue for years. A ceremonial core may lose political importance while still remaining symbolically significant. One causeway may grow quiet, while another path, informal and muddy and much more useful, becomes the road people actually take. Archaeologists see these gradients in material remains, signs of reduced maintenance, reused spaces, altered household patterns, fewer prestige goods, and less evidence of central planning. It is less like a city dying in one theatrical breath and more like a body gradually deciding which functions it can no longer afford. In some places, even as elite institutions weakened, people may have repurposed space in very practical ways. Structures once built for ritual or status could become sources of stone, shelter, or simply landmarks in a smaller local world. Human beings are efficient that way. A once sacred staircase may become, after enough historical disappointment, a very useful pile of cut blocks. There is something almost offensively sensible about this. Future tourists admire the ruin. The local resident of the period probably admired the fact that one part of it could be carried home and turned into a wall. And then there is memory, which is more durable than plaster, but harder to excavate. Even after cities declined, people would have remembered what those places once meant. Grandparents would have told children about seasons when the markets were fuller, the ceremonies larger, the roads more crowded, and the rulers still important enough to be worth gossiping about. Memory has a way of keeping old systems alive long after they stop functioning. A place can still be sacred even if it is no longer politically central. A ruined court can still shape identity long after its accounting has collapsed. This means the aftermath of the classic collapse was not simply practical relocation, it was also emotional and cultural renegotiation. People were not leaving empty space. They were leaving places dense with ancestry, ritual, and habit. There is something especially melancholy in that kind of departure. It is not the clean escape of someone happily starting over. It is the slow recognition that the place where your parents invested their labor and your rulers invested their certainty may not have enough future left to justify staying. One imagines conversations that no monument records. Is the harvest worse here than near the northern routes? Is the water better near the wetlands? Did your sister not already leave last year? Did the local lord not ask for yet another round of labor? Yes, the temple is magnificent. No, magnificence is not edible. These are the sorts of exchanges that change history without ever appearing in royal inscriptions. And this is one reason the old romantic language of mysterious disappearance is so unhelpful. Disappearance suggests passivity or magic or sudden blankness. What we actually see is decision-making under pressure, movement, retrenchment, adaptation. A city empties not because its people turn into legend, but because too many of them conclude that their labor is better spent elsewhere. The forest later receives the credit because it is picturesque, but the real work of collapse is done by human choices accumulating quietly over time. Once enough households begin making those choices, the mathematics of urban life becomes unforgiving. Monumental centers are expensive organisms. They need not only food, but confidence. They need labor, maintenance, political coordination, ritual authority, and a population willing to keep showing up. When those ingredients diminish together, a city's scale becomes a liability. Reservoirs need cleaning. Plaster needs renewing. Causeways need repair. Temples do not collapse just because they are old. They collapse because fewer people remain willing or able to care whether the roof still holds. Civilization, in this sense, is often just maintenance with very good public relations. This is especially true for systems built around sacred kingship. In many classic Maya cities, rulers were not merely administrators with fancy headgear. They were embodiments of dynastic legitimacy, performers of cosmic order, mediators between living communities and divine or ancestral power. Their bodies, rituals, costumes, bloodletting, ceremonies, and inscriptions all reinforce the idea that the political center was also a sacred center. That kind of structure can be remarkably powerful when it works. But when it fails, it tends to fail in a distinctly embarrassing way. A tax collector can be resented and still remain a tax collector. A divinely sanctioned ruler who cannot protect the city from war, scarcity, and uncertainty begins to look less like the center of the cosmos and more like a very expensive local problem. We can imagine the strain this placed on royal courts in the final centuries of many southern lowland centers. To maintain legitimacy, rulers needed visible success. They needed captives from war, new monuments, rituals performed on time, alliance networks maintained, and enough surplus to keep the court splendid. Yet the very conditions making success harder also made visible display more necessary. It was a trap. If a ruler reduced ceremonial display, he looked weak. If he increased demands to fund it, he may have alienated the population whose support he desperately needed. This is not only an ancient problem, it is one of humanity's recurring talents, making a crisis more difficult because the symbols of control must be preserved at any cost, right up to the moment everyone notices the cost was absurd. One of the more revealing archaeological signals is the decline in stele erection and other dated monuments. In earlier centuries, rulers were delighted to commemorate accessions, victories, period endings, and assorted proof that time itself admired them. Then, in many sites, the record thins. Silence spreads. This does not happen because scribes all retire at once to pursue more peaceful hobbies. It happens because the institutional world that demanded public stone memory is shrinking or collapsing. A city that no longer erects monuments is not necessarily uninhabited, but it is telling us that the political class has lost either the means or the point of inscribing itself into permanence. And permanence, after all, was one of the promises of these systems. Monumental architecture does not merely impress the present. It informs the future that the current order expects to last. A ruler commissions stone because wood rots and people gossip. Stone suggests destiny. So when a generation stops commissioning stone, it marks more than economic trouble. It marks a crisis of futurity. The elite are no longer able to confidently project themselves ahead. Their horizon has narrowed. The city may continue physically, but its public imagination of itself has already dimmed. Meanwhile, daily life keeps happening in a way that is stubbornly immune to narrative elegance. Children still need feeding. Pottery still breaks. Fields still require labor whether or not the king has had an ominous dream. This is why collapses can proceed surprisingly far before outsiders would call them by that name. Human communities are incredibly good at normalizing strain. Another poor rainy season becomes the kind of year we're having. Another military defeat becomes unfortunate news from the West. Another abandoned district becomes the place where people used to live. By the time the full scale of transformation becomes obvious, families may have been adapting for decades. There is also a social geography to these changes. Elites, commoners, craft specialists, traders, and farmers did not all experience the same risks. Some groups may have lost prestige before livelihood. Others may have lost livelihood before prestige. Artisans dependent on elite sponsorship might have suffered early as court demand fell. Farmers near dependable water sources may have fared better than those on more fragile land. Merchants could perhaps redirect routes where villagers could not redirect rainfall. This unevenness matters because collapse does not descend like identical fog. It sorts people differently. Some are ruined quickly. Some adjust. Some profit briefly from other people's losses. History is rude like that. So when we picture the great Maya collapse, we should not imagine one uniformly dark horizon. We should imagine many local horizons, some dimming sooner, some later, some shifting northward, some settling into smaller but more sustainable patterns. One city's end could be another region's beginning. One family's displacement could feed the growth of a new center elsewhere. Power was not evaporating. It was redistributing, often painfully and unevenly, across the Maya world. The northern Maya lowlands become especially important in this later story, because while many southern lowland centers declined during the terminal classic period, northern centers did not simply sit in the dark nodding gravely. They rose, adapted, and in some cases became major powers. This is one of the clearest reasons the word collapse has to be used carefully. A civilization disappearing would leave very little room for regional resurgence. What we actually see is a reorientation of political and economic gravity. Places like Chichen Itza emerged as major centers with extensive influence, different architectural programs, and new forms of political life that did not simply replicate the old classic Southern model. That shift is not a footnote. It is one of the main things that happened. Now, Chichen Itza has its own dense scholarly debates because nothing in Maya history is allowed to remain simple for long. Questions of chronology, influence, connections with central Mexico, internal political structure, and the exact nature of its authority have all generated years of research and very thoughtful disagreement, which is exactly the sort of thing one hopes for in scholarship and slightly less what one hopes for when trying to explain history to a sleepy audience. But the key point is that the rise of northern centers shows continuity through transformation. The Maya world was not a light turned off. It was a network rewired under pressure. Northern lowland conditions were not identical to the south. Water systems, ecological constraints, trade routes, and political relationships differed. Coastal exchanges became increasingly important. Maritime trade along the Gulf and Caribbean littorals offered possibilities that inland southern cities could not access in the same way. If southern interior routes grew unstable or less profitable, coastal and northern networks could benefit. In this sense, part of what really happened in the Great Maya collapse is that older centers became less central to the flows of people, goods, and power. Geography did not change, but the usefulness of different geographies did. And usefulness has a way of becoming destiny in history. A city can be sacred, old, and monumental, and still lose out to a place with better access to trade, stronger regional alliances, or a more flexible political structure. That may sound unromantic, but most of history is a long argument between symbolism and logistics, with logistics winning far more often than people like to admit. It is difficult to maintain divine kingship in a failing interior city when a coastal network several days away is busy doing excellent business in salt, obsidian, cacao, and influence. This northern reorientation also tells us something about adaptation. Societies under stress do not only crumble, they innovate, imitate, borrow, simplify, and reorganize. Political forms change. Ritual expression shifts. Architecture adopts new emphasis. Economic ties adjust to new roots. Even where older institutions fail, new institutions emerge. That is what makes collapse historically fascinating and emotionally complicated. It is not merely death. It is selective survival. Some ideas die, others travel. Some ceremonies end in one city and continue in another. Some identities deepen precisely because the old order has broken apart. For ordinary people, these changes could mean migration into new circuits of life. A family leaving a declining southern center might find itself in a region where old dynastic hierarchies mattered less, where trade connections were different, where architectural styles and political expectations had changed, and where the future was being negotiated by other kinds of elites. There is something both hopeful and exhausting in that. Hopeful, because decline did not foreclose all possibility. Exhausting, because rebuilding life under new conditions is labor even when it works. Human resilience is admirable, but it is also tiring. People do not adapt because adaptation is exciting. They adapt because the alternative is worse. This is one reason the descendants of the Maya matter so much in telling this story properly. The living continuity of Maya peoples forces us to move beyond a ruin-centered view. The great southern cities did not have the last word on what Maya civilization was or became. Later, post-classic polities, village communities, ritual traditions, languages, agricultural knowledge, and social identities all carry forward Maya history after the classic collapse. To dwell only on abandoned temples is to mistake one historical form for the whole civilization. It is rather like assuming that if a capital city falls, the people suddenly forget how to be themselves. History has never been quite that convenient. At the same time, one should not overcorrect into pretending the collapse was unimportant. It was enormously important. The decline of the classic southern lowland city-state world was a profound transformation involving depopulation, institutional failure, political fragmentation, and deep hardship. It changed landscapes, redirected populations, and ended dynastic traditions that had shaped centuries of history. The point is not to soften it. The point is to name it accurately. A major collapse happened. It just did not happen to the Maya, as a people in the simplistic sense popular imagination likes to use. And so the story grows more interesting the longer we stay awake through it. which is slightly inconvenient for a sleep narrative, but excellent for history. The Great Maya collapse was both an ending and a redirection. It closed a chapter, not the book. It ruined certain cities, not a civilization's entire existence. It buried royal certainty in silence, while other Maya worlds elsewhere were busy learning how to live beyond it. Another useful way to understand the collapse is to compare what changed quickly with what changed slowly. Political institutions can fail within a generation. A dynasty can be overthrown, a court dispersed, a monumental program halted, and a region suddenly deprived of the elite language through which it once explained itself. But culture, at the level of household practice, tends to move more slowly. Foodways, farming knowledge, ritual habits, language, local identity, kinship ties, and seasonal rhythms can persist through enormous political upheaval. This difference in tempo helps explain why the archaeological record can show dramatic elite collapse alongside forms of ordinary continuity. The palace goes silent. The grinding stone remains in use. And there is something rather profound in that humble contrast. Civilizations often appear grandest from above, where we can see pyramids, palaces, inscriptions, and ruling dynasties. But they often survive from below, through repetitive, unglamorous acts. Planting, weaving, cooking, storing water, raising children, maintaining paths, remembering sacred places, and adjusting to the latest disappointment from the nearest authority figure. In the Maya case, the collapse of the classic court-centered order becomes more understandable when we stop asking only what the kings lost and start asking what ordinary communities carried with them. This matters especially because older scholarship often privileged the monumental at the expense of the lived. A city was defined by its temple complexes, as though farmers and potters had been decorative accessories to architecture. But of course the reverse is closer to reality. Temples depended on farmers and potters. Rulers depended on households. The great carved record of dynastic life exists only because vast numbers of less visible people generated the surplus and labor to support it. When those underlying supports shift, even the most splendid ideological system becomes surprisingly temporary. One may also wonder whether some aspects of the collapse were from below less disastrous than they were from above. This should be stated carefully, because hardship, displacement, hunger, and conflict were obviously serious. Still, if a household had long been burdened by labor obligations, tribute, war disruptions, and elite pageantry of questionable practical benefit, the weakening of a court might not have been mourned with unanimous devotion. The fall of a king is always tragic in stone inscriptions. Its meaning in kitchens is sometimes more mixed. History rarely allows us direct access to that opinion, but it would be strange to assume perfect enthusiasm for a system built on extraction simply because it produced beautiful ruins for later admiration. There may have been moments when people recognized that the old order was not going to recover. Not one dramatic revelation, perhaps, but a dawning accumulation of evidence. The road is less secure. The reservoir is lower again. The ruler has performed the rites, and still the weather is uncooperative. The neighboring city did not send traders this season. Another elite compound stands half-used. Your brother's family reports better conditions farther north. At some point, the practical mind overtakes the ceremonial one. The dynasty may still speak the language of permanence, but ordinary people begin quietly planning for something else. That shift from loyalty to calculation is one of the invisible engines of collapse. Institutions do not only fail because they are attacked, they fail because the people who sustain them stop believing they are worth the cost. In a highly stratified and ritually saturated society, that withdrawal is difficult to measure, but one suspects it mattered. You cannot maintain a monumental center on the basis of memory alone. You need bodies, harvests, labor schedules, and obedience. Once enough of those loosen, the city's fate changes, even if its temple remains physically impressive for centuries. The landscape itself also remembers in interesting ways. Ancient terraces, canals, reservoirs, causeways, and modified soils show how intensively the Maya shaped their environments. These are not signs of a civilization simply overwhelmed by wild nature. They are signs of a civilization deeply entangled with landscapes it had engineered for generations. When such a system falters, the result is not the triumph of untouched wilderness, but the succession of one human-nature relationship into another. Forest regrowth is part of the story, yes, but so is the long material afterlife of agricultural and urban labor embedded in the terrain. The jungle did not erase the Maya. It grew through the spaces they had once organized. Modern technologies have made this increasingly clear. Airborne LIDAR has revealed vast settlement webs beneath forest canopies, including roads, defensive features, agricultural modifications, and urban planning on a scale earlier explorers could only guess at. The old image of isolated ceremonial islands in a sea of jungle has become much harder to sustain. What emerges instead is a densely inhabited, extensively managed landscape whose collapse therefore becomes not a local mystery, but a regional restructuring of extraordinary magnitude. In other words, the Maya were even more impressive than people once thought, which unfortunately also means the stresses required to destabilize their systems were correspondingly profound. This larger scale also helps us understand why no single cause explanation has ever been satisfying. A dense, regionally connected system does not collapse in many places because one thing went slightly wrong. It collapses because multiple forms of pressure converge across interdependent networks. Drought without rivalry might be endured. Rivalry without ecological strain might be contained. Ecological strain without ideological brittleness might be managed. But interdependence means vulnerabilities travel. One city's instability becomes another city's problem. One region's drought becomes another region's migration pressure. One failed alliance opens a route for war elsewhere. Complexity creates wealth and brilliance. It also creates better ways for crisis to spread. At this point in the story, it may be useful to slow down and visit the matter of warfare again, because the older fantasy of the Maya as peaceful skywatchers lingers more stubbornly than it deserves. The decipherment of Maya inscriptions and the discovery of defensive works made it very clear that classic Maya politics could be violent, competitive, and rather unpleasant if one had the misfortune to be on the wrong side of a dynastic rivalry. Captives were taken, cities were attacked, rulers were humiliated, and alliance systems mattered deeply. The violence was not incidental decoration around a serene ritual life. It was part of how states operated and how prestige was maintained. When environmental stress enters such a system, warfare can become more than competition. it becomes a multiplier. Campaigns disrupt agriculture, remove labor, damage infrastructure, and create insecurity in trade routes. Defeat can delegitimize rulers already under strain. Refugees may move into neighboring territories. Tribute systems are interrupted or intensified. Fortification becomes necessary, diverting still more labor. And because the Maya world was politically fragmented, there was no reliable central authority to suspend conflict for the common good. That would have required a level of regional self-restraint not especially common in history. Rival kings generally do not look at a drought and conclude that the time has come for cooperative moderation. More often, they see opportunity, which is exactly the problem. Some scholars have suggested that as older hegemonies weakened, competition intensified among successor powers, leading to more unstable and destructive warfare. If true, this would mean that collapse was not simply a system receiving outside shocks, but a system reacting to stress in ways that made its own situation worse. That is, regrettably, a very human pattern. Institutions under pressure often become more extractive, more symbolic, and more aggressive precisely when flexibility would serve them better. The Maya were no exception to that broader tendency. There is also the matter of fortifications. In some regions, the archaeological record includes walls, ditches, and defensible site placements that suggest real concern with attack. These are not the signs of a society calmly passing into retirement. They indicate danger. A city that fortifies itself is admitting in stone and earth that political order is now unreliable enough to require constant defense. That shifts the feel of life dramatically. Travel becomes riskier. Agricultural labor may be interrupted. Trust thins. And once fear becomes built into settlement design, it is difficult to pretend the old order remains comfortably intact. The emotional texture of such a world is hard to reconstruct, but not impossible to imagine. Messages travel more slowly and rumors more quickly. A captured noble from a neighboring city might mean shifting alliances. A defeat on one front could expose fields elsewhere. Traders arriving with thin goods and heavy stories would carry more than merchandise. Under these conditions, even communities not directly attacked would feel the tremors. Collapse, in a politically fractured world, is often experienced first as uncertainty rather than ruin. One does not necessarily see the end. One senses that reliability has gone missing, and this returns us to kingship, because sacred political systems rely heavily on reliability. The ruler does not merely govern, he anchors meaning. He tells the city that the calendar still aligns, the ancestors still approve, the gods still receive proper rites, and the wider world still has a center. Repeated military or environmental failure undermines that claim even if no one says so aloud. Publicly, one continues the ceremonies. Privately, one notices that the crops remain poor. The dissonance accumulates. Eventually, even the most elaborate ritual cannot entirely hide the fact that the system no longer secures the things it once promised. There may also have been local rebellions or internal fractures within elites themselves. Dynastic systems are not necessarily stable at the best of times. Succession disputes, factional competition, and noble rivalries can all weaken a polity from within. Under stress, these divisions become more dangerous. An ambitious faction might gamble on a coup. A subordinate center might stop obeying. A royal marriage meant to stabilize relations may become useless the moment one side loses military credibility. Political fragmentation need not always come from dramatic conquest. It can emerge from 100 internal calculations that the old center no longer commands enough advantage to justify loyalty. This is one reason the Maya case resists simple moral lessons. It is not a story of one foolish decision or one ecological mistake. It is a story of interlocking structures that made sense in periods of success and became liabilities under prolonged stress. Monument building was not foolish in a flourishing polity. Competitive kingship was not irrational in a world where prestige shaped survival. Intensive agriculture was not reckless in a growing population. The problem is that systems optimized for expansion are not always good at contraction. The classic southern lowland Maya seem to have been exceptionally capable at building complexity and considerably less capable of shrinking it gently, and perhaps very few societies ever are. Graceful decline is not a standard human achievement. More often, institutions deny, extract, posture, and fragment until the people beneath them begin solving their own problems elsewhere. The Maya, to put it mildly, were not unique in that regard. They were simply good enough at architecture that the consequences remained visible for a very long time. So far we have discussed drought, warfare, environmental stress, elite legitimacy, rural support, and regional reorientation. But another theme deserves a quieter spotlight. Time. Not calendar time, though the Maya cared about that immensely, but generational time. The collapse unfolded over enough decades that children born into early instability may have thought of uncertainty as normal by adulthood. That matters because people do not respond to prolonged crisis in the same way they respond to one shock. They adapt psychologically. They lower expectations. They normalize absence. They stop comparing the present to the golden age and start comparing it to last year's inconvenience. This is how major transformation becomes livable while it is happening. For an older generation, the diminished city might have felt tragic. They remembered larger festivals, stronger rulers, fuller markets, and the easy confidence of earlier decades. For younger adults, the same city might simply have felt burdensome, half-empty, and oddly impractical. Why preserve a great ceremonial core if it no longer organizes security, trade, or food reliably? Why remain attached to a political center whose main remaining strength is nostalgia? Every collapse contains this generational difference. Memory clings, youth calculates. Between the two, the future changes its address. This generational drift may help explain why some monumental centers were not revived, even when parts of the surrounding population survived. Reviving a court-centered city requires more than people. It requires a renewed consensus that this is still where political and sacred investment should go. Once that consensus is gone, the architecture may be admired, feared, or remembered, but not necessarily rebuilt as the center of life. A city can lose its future before it loses its stones. There is a sleepy irony here. The classic Maya were masters of recording time in elegant systems, aligning monuments with celestial cycles, and situating their rulers within vast temporal orders. Yet the collapse reminds us that societies are undone not only by cosmic time, but by the much duller sequence of years in which institutions fail to solve practical problems. The sun rises correctly. Venus behaves itself. The reservoir is still low. This is not a contradiction. It is simply the gap between cosmological sophistication and political resilience. One may understand the heavens perfectly well and still have a terrible decade on Earth. We should also say something about agriculture beyond generalized stress, because Maya farming was not simplistic slash-and-burn chaos, as older stereotypes sometimes implied. It included varied techniques adapted to local ecologies: terracing, raised fields and wetlands, orchard-like management of useful trees, household gardens, and carefully timed cropping strategies. The Maya were excellent land managers in many contexts, but no agricultural system is invincible. In regions with dense populations and variable rainfall, the margin between success and hardship can narrow under repeated drought or disruption. Good systems do not cease to be good. They cease to be sufficient for current pressures. And once agriculture becomes less reliable, everything else tightens. Food surplus is the quiet fuel of urban civilization. It supports elites, artisans, builders, warriors, traders, ritual specialists, and all the people whose work is not directly producing calories. When surplus contracts, political choice narrows. Courts can demand more and risk revolt, or accept less and risk weakness. Households can give more and risk hunger, or withhold and risk punishment. Every decision becomes a negotiation with scarcity. That does not produce calm, generous politics. It produces brittle ones. A further complication is that even successful adaptation at the household level may undermine the old political system. Suppose families shift towards smaller, more dispersed settlement patterns that better suit local conditions. Good for survival, perhaps, less good for maintaining a monumental urban core. Suppose traders reroute exchange toward coastal or northern networks, sensible economically, less helpful for a southern inland dynasty. Suppose local leaders emerge who offer more immediate protection than a distant sacred king, useful in crisis, not ideal for centralized authority. In this way, adaptation and collapse can happen simultaneously. The society is not simply failing. Parts of it are surviving by ceasing to support the previous form. This is one of the most historically rich aspects of the Great Maya collapse. It was not merely catastrophe visited upon passive populations. It was transformation partly driven by successful local decisions made in response to broader failure. Families moved, communities reoriented, economic networks shifted, political loyalties changed. What looks like collapse from the viewpoint of a royal capital may look like reorganization from the viewpoint of a household trying to remain fed and safe. Both are true, and history, being difficult, insists on keeping them both true at once. It is also possible that some Maya elites recognized the old model was failing and tried to modify it. Not every ruler was blindly marching toward doom and ceremonial feathers. Some may have invested in water systems, restructured alliances, or relocated centers strategically. But reform inside a competitive sacred kingship system is not easy. Too much change risks appearing illegitimate. Too little change risks irrelevance. The balance is terrible, and there are very few examples in history of elites elegantly solving that dilemma under mounting pressure. More often, they do what elites tend to do: preserve the visible markers of authority while the underlying conditions erode, which is perhaps why ruins feel so moving. They are the visible markers left after the underlying conditions are long gone. A staircase remains. The labor system that built it does not. A carved king remains. The belief that sustained him does not survive in the same form. A reservoir remains. The civic order that once maintained it has dissolved into later landscapes and later lives. Stones endure, systems do not. And the Maya, with their talent for stone, left us one of the clearest records of that melancholy imbalance. By the time many southern lowland centers had ceased to function as major political capitals, the map of the Maya world had become something new. The old classic order, with its dynastic monuments and sacred courts rising from the forest, had fragmented into a different constellation of power, trade, ritual, and settlement. Some places declined into relative obscurity. Others flourished under new arrangements. If one insists on a single dramatic sentence, the safest version is this: the old heartland stopped beating in the same way, and the blood of civilization found other roots. It is perhaps not the most soothing metaphor before sleep, but it is reasonably accurate. This broader view helps explain why the question, what really happened, is both easy and hard to answer. Easy, because scholars now know much more than they once did. Hard, because what happened depends on scale. At the scale of dynasties, what happened was political collapse. At the scale of cities, what happened was depopulation and abandonment in many areas. At the scale of households, what happened was adaptation, migration, improvisation, and endurance. At the scale of the Maya world as a whole, what happened was transformation rather than extinction. All of these answers are correct, and all of them are incomplete when stated alone. The challenge of public history is that audiences often want one layer to stand for all the others. If we say the Maya collapsed, it sounds simple and vast. If we say many classic southern lowland urban dynastic systems became unsustainable under converging pressures while other Maya regions continued and later flourished, it sounds accurate and mildly determined to prevent a good trailer. But the second version has the advantage of not being wrong. And for a history for sleep story, that is important. People should drift off with the right kind of confusion, not the avoidable kind. There is also a temptation, especially in modern times, to read the collapse primarily as a warning about environmental disaster. Certainly, climate stress appears to have mattered deeply. Repeated droughts in already stretched regions could be devastating. Environmental management was central. Water systems were crucial. The Maya case absolutely demonstrates how ecological stress can destabilize complex societies, especially when politics and inequality prevent flexible response. But if we turn the whole story into they mistreated the environment and collapsed, we lose the equally important roles of warfare, ideology, political fragmentation, and regional reorientation. The Maya were not a morality play produced for our convenience. They were a civilization living in history, not a lecture slide with better architecture. At the same time, there is no need to deny the contemporary resonance. The Maya case is compelling precisely because it shows how intertwined pressures work. Climate alone is rarely the whole story. Politics alone is rarely the whole story. Social inequality alone is rarely the whole story, but put them together in a system already stretched by scale and competition, and resilience begins to thin. One does not need to abuse analogy to notice the pattern. It is a disturbingly familiar one. Human beings remain committed to discovering again and again that complexity is marvelous until it becomes delicate. And yet, the Maya also offer a quieter lesson in continuity. Even after the collapse of the classic southern lowland order, Maya peoples continued to farm, trade, worship, speak, govern, remember, and adapt. Later states emerged. Communities endured into the colonial era and beyond. Modern Maya peoples are not footnotes to ruins. They are the living continuation of histories far richer than the moment of 9th century crisis alone. This is important not only morally, but historically. If we focus only on collapse, we accidentally reproduce the old habit of treating indigenous civilizations as tragic scenery rather than ongoing worlds. There is a strange dignity in the fact that the most famous thing about the classic Maya for many outsiders is their collapse, while the deeper truth is their persistence. The cities of divine kings faltered. The people did not stop being Maya. That distinction deserves to be repeated with almost tedious patience because the older myth of disappearance has been so persistent and so wrong. Civilizations are not only their courts, they are also the hands that keep grinding maize when the court has failed. Imagine, then, one last view of a declining southern capital from a nearby hill. Smoke rises from some household hearths, but not others. The ceremonial core still catches the light, though weeds press in at the edges of once cleared spaces. A few people move through the plaza, but nowhere near the numbers it was built to impress. Somewhere beyond the visible ridge, families are already on the move toward regions where trade is better, water more dependable, or power less ceremonial and more useful. The old city is not dead in a theatrical sense. It is simply no longer where enough lives converge. History often ends exactly there, not in destruction, but in the loss of centrality. And once centrality is gone, the rest follows with weary logic. Maintenance slows, memory thickens, ritual becomes local rather than imperial. The next generation knows the place as old rather than inevitable. Forest margins advance, and eventually later centuries encounter the ruins and ask what unimaginable catastrophe occurred, when in fact the answer is something more familiar and more human. Too many strains, too little flexibility, and too many people deciding one household at a time that the future had moved elsewhere. Later on, when Europeans arrived in the Maya world centuries after the classic collapse, they did not find a vanished civilization. They found living Maya peoples in diverse communities, some organized into their own polities, many with traditions and political forms shaped by the long centuries since the 9th century transformations. This is an important final correction to the myth. The ruins of Tikal or Palenque are not evidence that the Maya disappeared. They are evidence that one major historical phase ended long before colonial contact, while Maya societies continued in other forms. If that sounds less thrilling than lost civilization, that is because truth is sometimes less theatrical and more respectful. Unfortunately, colonial ways of seeing often preferred the theatrical version. Ruins were admired, living indigenous peoples ignored or diminished, and the achievements of the past were detached from the descendants standing nearby. That habit distorted Maya history for a long time. It treated monumental architecture as belonging to a dead mystery and actual Maya communities, as somehow unrelated to it. Modern scholarship has done much to repair this, but popular imagination still lags behind, happily wandering through vine-covered fantasies while living history waits patiently off to the side. This matters because the way we tell collapse stories shapes what we think civilization is. If civilization is only monumental cities, then when the city declines, the civilization is said to vanish. But if civilization includes language, social memory, agricultural knowledge, ritual practice, local identity, and enduring communities, then collapse looks different. It still hurts. It still transforms. It can still be devastating, but it does not necessarily erase. The Maya case is one of the clearest examples of that distinction, and one of the reasons historians keep returning to it with a mixture of fascination and irritation at how badly it is often simplified. One can also say that the Maya collapse was dramatic precisely because the classic cities were so successful. Their architecture, writing, calendrics, and urban design were astonishing. Their political worlds were intricately developed. Their ceremonial spaces were enormous statements of order and legitimacy. When such a world falters, the contrast between former splendor and later quiet is emotionally powerful. A modest village declining does not usually become an international symbol of mystery. A ceremonial city of pyramids half covered by jungle certainly does. We are, as a species, very easy to impress with stone. But stone is not the whole story, and perhaps not even the most important one. The more intimate story belongs to the people who kept going after the stone-centered order receded. There is courage in that, though perhaps courage is too dramatic a word for what was often simply necessity. Survival is not always heroic in tone. Sometimes it is dull, repetitive, and carried out by tired people who would have preferred not to live through historical transition at all. Still, there is a kind of greatness in those quieter continuities. Dynasties fail loudly, households endure softly. As for what scholars today generally think, the safest summary is still a multi-causal model. Repeated drought episodes likely strained agricultural and water systems. Political fragmentation and warfare intensified insecurity. Population pressure and environmental modification narrowed resilience in some regions. Elite ideology, centered on sacred kingship, became harder to sustain under visible failure. Trade and regional power shifted. Populations dispersed and reorganized. Some cities were abandoned, others shrank. Northern centers rose. The classic southern lowland order ended. That is the broad consensus, though local details remain debated and will probably continue to be debated for as long as archaeology remains funded and graduate students remain optimistic. And perhaps that open-endedness is appropriate. The Maya themselves were obsessed in sophisticated ways with cycles, time, and the inscription of history. It feels fitting that their own great transformation resists being pinned to one clean sentence. The collapse was real enough to reshape a civilization's geography and political form. It was complex enough to refuse simplification. It was tragic enough to merit seriousness. And it was incomplete enough that calling it disappearance does violence to the actual historical continuity that followed. So if someone asks, very confidently, what happened to the Maya, the most honest, sleepy answer is that the Maya did not vanish. Many of their great classic southern lowland cities declined because interconnected stresses made the old system unsustainable. The rulers lost control. The monumental centers emptied. The political map changed. But Maya people remained, adapted, and continued. In other words, the collapse was not a magic trick, it was history, which is usually slower, sadder, and more administrative than people expect. And on that note, one begins to appreciate why ruins are so seductive. They seem to offer a simple visual ending. The city is empty, the stones are cracked, the trees are back, the mystery is served. But the reality behind them is more demanding. It asks us to picture households leaving in stages, rulers failing in installments, landscapes becoming less forgiving, alliances turning brittle, markets thinning, children growing up in altered worlds, and memory carrying pieces of the old order forward into new places. It is less cinematic. It is also, quietly, far more powerful. If we were being especially dry about the whole matter, we might say the great Maya collapse was what happens when a highly accomplished network of competitive city-states, heavily invested in ceremonial kingship, ecological management, prestige display, and regional rivalry, encounters prolonged stress and proves much better at glory than graceful downsizing. This is not the sort of summary one sees on souvenir T-shirts, but it does have the virtue of sounding like history instead of legend. There is also something revealing in how often people want collapse stories to revolve around a secret, a hidden cause, a single disaster, an unexpected invasion, a mysterious plague, a forgotten prophecy. The truth is usually less exotic. Civilizations decline for reasons that are, in retrospect, almost annoyingly recognizable. Scarcity, conflict, inequality, institutional rigidity, environmental strain, shifting trade, failed legitimacy, people moving away. The Maya case is fascinating not because it defies human patterns, but because it fits them so well while leaving behind exceptional material traces. The stones are extraordinary. The mechanisms are depressingly familiar, and perhaps that is why the story remains compelling. It is not just about the Maya. It is about the strange bargain of civilization itself. To build complexity is to gain power, beauty, specialization, memory, and scale. It is also to become dependent on coordination, surplus, legitimacy, and systems maintenance. The more dazzling the achievement, the more there is to lose when strain accumulates. The classic Maya built one of the great urban and intellectual traditions of the pre-modern Americas. Their collapse reminds us that sophistication and vulnerability are not opposites. They are very often roommates. Still, one should resist ending in gloom alone. The Maya story is not merely about failure. It is also about the astonishing durability of human adaptation. The people who moved away from declining southern centers did not step out of history. They carried crops, stories, techniques, rituals, and social ties into other landscapes and other futures. Later, Maya societies built new centers, negotiated new political worlds, and endured catastrophes far beyond the classic collapse, including conquest, forced labor, disease, and colonial domination. Survival after collapse is not tidy, but it is history's most common sequel. There is something quietly moving in the fact that one can stand today amid the ruins of a classic city and still be within a world that is not truly gone. Maya languages are still spoken. Maya communities still remember, celebrate, resist, and endure. The stones belong not only to the past, but to a continuing civilizational story. That continuity should make us gentler with the word collapse. Not because it is wrong, but because it must be aimed precisely. It names the failure of a form, not the erasure of a people. And that, perhaps, is the final emotional adjustment the topic requires. We are used to asking, why did they disappear? Because disappearance flatters our sense of mystery. A vanished civilization is easier to romanticize than a transformed one. Transformation demands that we think about migration, survival, adaptation, and continuity, all of which are less neat than disappearance and much more human. The Maya did not leave us a single vanishing act. They left us a lesson in what happens when great centers fail, but life continues through other channels. The forest, of course, still plays its role in our imagination. It drapes the ruins beautifully, it softens edges, it gives abandoned stones the dignity of silence. But forests are not explanations. They are after effects. The real explanation lies in the choices, pressures, and failures that came before the vines. The jungle is what happens after the labor schedules stop. It is scenery for aftermath, not the author of it, which is a shame for the jungle perhaps, because it does excellent visual work and receives far more credit than the more boring but decisive forces of drought, politics, and logistics. So, if we return one last time to the original question, what really happened, the answer is this. The Great Maya collapse was a long, uneven, regionally varied breakdown of the classic southern lowland political order. It happened because multiple pressures converged. Climatic instability, especially drought, intensified warfare, and political fragmentation, ecological strain in some densely settled regions, rigid and unequal elite systems, and the eventual movement of people, trade, and power into different arrangements and regions. The great ceremonial capitals lost their central role. Many were abandoned or drastically reduced. Maya civilization itself continued. There is nothing disappointing in that answer, except perhaps to those who preferred a more dramatic mystery. But history rarely owes us drama in the forms we request. More often, it gives us complexity and then leaves us to make peace with it. The Maya, in that sense, are no exception. Their collapse was not magical. It was structural. It was not total. It was transformative. It was not the end of a people. It was the end of an old way of organizing power in a particular part of the Maya world. And that, for a civilization so attentive to cycles, feels almost fitting. One order closes, another begins. Stones remain, meanings shift. People endure. The calendar moves on. The calendar moves on. It always does, even when kings do not. Even when dynasties fail, even when the plaza is quieter than anyone once imagined possible. That may be the softest ending to the great Maya collapse. Not an explosion, not a final cry from the pyramids, but the continued passing of days in which the old order gradually became the old order. A child learned a route that no longer passed through the great court. A farmer sowed a field farther from the city than his grandfather did. A trader set his hopes on a different network. A priest adjusted a ritual to a diminished community. A family left. Another stayed a while longer, and history, patient and unsentimental, let the center shift. If you strip away the romance, this is what remains. The southern classic Maya world did not cease because its people forgot how to live. It ceased, in many places, to support particular combination of dense urbanism, sacred kingship, monumental ambition, and political competition that had once made those cities powerful. The supporting ecology grew less forgiving. The politics grew harsher. The ideology grew harder to sustain. The costs of staying increased. The benefits of leaving or simply investing elsewhere grew clearer. Over time, the old capitals became too heavy for the future to keep carrying. That is not a failure of intelligence. It is not proof that the Maya were careless or naive. It is proof that complex systems have thresholds, that success can make societies dependent on fragile balances, and that political forms suited to expansion often struggle when contraction becomes necessary. The Maya happened to record their glory in extraordinary ways. So we get to watch the afterlife of that struggle in stone. Most societies do the same sort of thing with much worse architecture, and yet, perhaps the most important truth is the gentlest one. The Maya are not best understood as a warning preserved in ruins. They are also a reminder that people outlast institutions. Courts rise and fall. Palaces are abandoned. Trade routes move. Sacred centers lose their force. But communities adapt. Knowledge travels. Identity persists. Even in the shadow of major collapse, life keeps reorganizing itself into forms that historians later have to learn, somewhat awkwardly, not to ignore. So the next time the phrase Great Maya Collapse appears, it may be worth hearing it with a quieter ear. Not as the tale of a vanished civilization, but as the story of a monumental political order in the southern lowlands that unraveled under the weight of many pressures. Not as the jungle swallowing a mystery, but as households, rulers, farmers, warriors, and traders all responding to conditions that no longer allowed the old balance to hold. Not as an ending clean enough for myth, but as a transformation messy enough for reality. And reality, for all its inconveniences, is more interesting. It contains drought and dynasties, reservoirs and resentment, warfare and migration, ruined stelae and living descendants. It gives us cities that fell silent and peoples who did not. It gives us the melancholy of abandoned places and the quieter dignity of continuity beyond them. That is a much better story than Disappearance, even if it is less cooperative with dramatic voiceovers. So let the forest have its ruins. Let the temple stand half in shadow. Let the carved kings watch no one in particular, and let us remember what really happened. The Maya did not vanish. Their classic southern urban political system in many regions failed under converging stresses. People adapted, power shifted, new centers rose, old ones emptied. The civilization changed form and kept going, which is, in the end, a very human outcome, untidy, uneven, a little tragic, more durable than it looks. And now, as the night settles properly over the stones, we can leave the old cities where they are, still impressive, still quiet, still misunderstood by anyone who insists on one dramatic cause. The truth is slower than that. It comes in dry years, failed alliances, thin markets, stubborn households, and decisions made without any awareness that future centuries will call them history. The Great Maya Collapse, like so many great collapses, was really a long surrender of one kind of order and the patient survival of life beyond it. That is all for tonight. Some inscriptions from the late 8th and 9th centuries show signs of this political unraveling. Royal monuments become less frequent in some places. Dates that once marked dynastic continuity start to disappear. Great cities that had long celebrated their rulers simply stop producing the usual public record. This silence is eerie, though it was probably much louder at the time. A city does not stop carving royal texts because everyone is feeling optimistic. It stops because the institutions that supported kingship, elite display, and monumental construction are weakening or gone. Perhaps the dynasty fell. Perhaps the court scattered. Perhaps the population dropped below the level needed to sustain the project. Perhaps no one felt particularly inspired to commemorate another accession while the reservoirs were shrinking. Population pressure may also have played a role, though this varies by region. Some Maya cities grew impressively large, supporting dense populations through intensive agriculture, terracing, raised fields, household gardens, forest management, and trade. These systems were ingenious, and the Maya were not clumsy destroyers of nature blundering through the rainforest with no plan. They managed landscapes actively and with considerable skill. Still, even sophisticated systems have limits. As populations expanded and elite demands grew, local environments may have become more strained. Deforestation for fuel, lime plaster production, construction, and agriculture could alter water retention and soil conditions. Clearing forests can change local temperatures and reduce moisture. Once again, not ideal when one society already depends heavily on delicate rainfall patterns. There is something quietly tragic about how successful societies can set the stage for their own vulnerability. The very achievements of the classic Maya cities made them more dependent on complex coordination. Monumental architecture required labor and food surpluses. Large populations required reliable agriculture and water storage. Elite courts required tribute, legitimacy, and political stability. Trade in luxury goods reinforced status systems. Everything worked together until it didn't. A village can survive a bad year by tightening its belt. A magnificent city full of nobles, ritual specialists, craftsmen, and monumental obligations is harder to downsize gracefully. Trade, too, was part of the story. Maya cities were connected by networks moving obsidian, jade, cacao, salt, feathers, ceramics, and other goods across great distances. These were not merely luxuries. Trade also linked regions ecologically and politically. If one route faltered due to war or abandonment, local economies could feel the strain. A royal court that relied on exotic goods to display power would look less impressive without them. Prestige has always been surprisingly dependent on supply chains. Even in antiquity, one suspects there were worried officials saying things like, "The jade is delayed again," in tones of mounting despair. But even with all these factors, collapse did not happen evenly or everywhere at once. This is another reason the old dramatic image is misleading. Some cities declined earlier, some later. Some regions proved more resilient. The northern Maya areas, including sites like Chichen Itza, remained active, and in some periods rose to great prominence after many southern lowland centers had declined. This means the story is not one of total civilizational extinction, but of regional transformation. Power shifted, networks reoriented. Some urban traditions faded, while others adapted. The jungle did not swallow everything in a single theatrical gulp. It was more like a long, uneven redistribution of people, power, and possibility. Archaeologists see this in settlement patterns. In some places, populations dropped sharply. In others, occupation continued at smaller scale. Some ceremonial centers were abandoned while rural life persisted nearby. Some elite compounds fell into ruin while commoner households lingered. This distinction matters because it reminds us that history is often written first by the loudest architecture. A temple collapsing into silence looks like the end of the world. A village quietly continuing without royal pageantry looks less cinematic, but perhaps more human. There is also the question of agency. When people hear of collapse, they sometimes imagine passive victims of drought or fate. But Maya communities were making choices. They migrated, they reorganized, they adapted farming methods, they formed new political arrangements, they abandoned some places deliberately. To leave a once grand city might seem like defeat, but it can also be survival. If the reservoirs fail, the court is unstable, the taxes remain high, and the gods appear unavailable for comment. Moving elsewhere begins to look like a very practical decision. Civilizations do not only fall apart from above, sometimes they are quietly emptied from below by countless households deciding that the glorious center is no longer worth the trouble. It is worth lingering for a moment on what daily life may have felt like during this long decline. Imagine living in a community tied to a major city during a period of worsening uncertainty. Perhaps your family farms maize, beans, squash, and chili. Perhaps you owe labor to local elites or obligations to a temple complex. In a good year, life is hard but familiar. There are rituals, markets, festivals, marriages, rivalries, and the rhythm of planting and harvest. But then the rains become unreliable. A neighboring polity raids nearby territory. Traders arrive less often. Rumors spread that an allied king has been captured. The local ruler orders new ceremonies to restore cosmic balance. More tribute is demanded. More labor is requested. The reservoir looks lower than it should. The old confidence begins to thin. There is no need to imagine everyone panicking at once. Real decline is usually slower, more repetitive, and frankly, more bureaucratic than that. One poor harvest does not end a city. Two do not necessarily end it either. People cut back, improvise, borrow, endure, and hope next season will be better. That is part of what makes collapse so difficult to see from within. It is often experienced not as one event, but as a long string of inconveniences, shortages, repairs, disappointments, small departures, quiet funerals, abandoned projects, and half-believed promises that normal order will soon return. Even the word collapse is a label imposed from the outside. To the people living through it, it may have felt like years of mounting instability in which each individual crisis could still, in theory, be the last one before recovery. History can be cruelly optimistic like that. For Maya rulers, the situation may have been especially dangerous because their legitimacy rested on both success and spectacle. Ceremonies, monuments, and public performances were not optional decorations. They were part of how power worked. Kings displayed continuity, divine favor, and military prowess through ritual acts and inscriptions. If resources shrank, maintaining these performances became harder, yet if they stopped, authority weakened further. This is the trap of symbolic politics. One must look powerful in order to remain powerful, but looking powerful can be expensive, especially in a drought. It is difficult to impress hungry subjects with another giant stone portrait of yourself unless you can also provide water. Archaeological evidence from some sites suggests social stress and fortification. Defensive walls appear around certain centers. Some settlements move to more defensible locations. Elite compounds show damage or abrupt endings. At places like Dos Pilas, warfare seems to have been intense and destructive. Elsewhere, once thriving centers such as Tikal, Copan, and Palenque saw a decline in royal inscriptions and monumental activity. Each site has its own chronology and local conditions, which is another reason scholars resist one-size-fits-all explanations. Telling the story city by city is more accurate but also less convenient for people who enjoy a single dramatic sentence. Sadly, for the dramatic sentence, the truth remains stubbornly regional. One city might have been weakened first by dynastic conflict, then hit by drought, then undermined by trade disruption. Another might have persisted longer because its local water management was stronger, or its political rivals were temporarily weaker. Another may have benefited from migration until its own systems became stressed. This variability is important because it reminds us that collapse is usually a process of cascading failures, not a universal timer going off in the jungle. It is not that every Maya city heard a celestial bell ring in the year 810 and agreed to close permanently. That would have required a degree of coordination rare even in healthy administrations. There is also the older myth that the Maya somehow exhausted the land through simple incompetence, as though brilliant astronomers and engineers mysteriously forgot that forests matter. Modern scholarship is more careful. The Maya altered their environment significantly, yes, but they also developed sophisticated land use practices. The issue was not ignorance. It was scale, pressure, and vulnerability. Under conditions of climatic stress and political competition, even well-managed systems can be pushed too far. This is a far more familiar and sobering lesson. People do not need to be foolish to be overwhelmed. They need only be embedded in a system whose margins have narrowed. The role of drought deserves another slow look because it has become central to many discussions of the collapse. Paleoclimate evidence from lake cores and cave deposits points to intervals of severe reduced rainfall around the time many southern lowland centers were declining. Some of these droughts may have been multi-year or recurrent, which is especially damaging. Tropical environments can look lush and eternal, but agricultural calendars are precise things. Reservoirs that fail to fill, fields that dry too early, and forests under stress all affect food security. Water storage systems can buffer a society for a while, but not indefinitely. If drought struck a region already divided by war and burdened by elite demands, it could turn chronic problems into fatal ones. Still, climate does not act alone. A drought is a stressor, not a script. Two societies can face the same climatic event and respond differently depending on governance, infrastructure, inequality, flexibility, and social trust. This is where the Maya case becomes both historically fascinating and uncomfortably modern. The question is not simply whether it stopped raining enough. The question is how a politically fragmented, highly stratified monument-building society handled environmental stress when its institutions were already under pressure. The answer, in many regions, appears to be not well, and yet, again, not uniformly badly. Some communities endured, some traditions continued, some knowledge persisted. The Maya calendar, writing, ritual systems, agricultural expertise, and cultural identity did not evaporate. Even after the classic collapse, later Maya polities flourished in different forms. Post-classic centers in the north became important, and long after the Spanish arrived, Maya communities continued to preserve language, memory, and tradition under terrible conditions of conquest and colonial violence. So the phrase, Great Maya Collapse, can mislead by making the Maya sound like a lost people rather than a transformed civilization whose descendants are very much alive. The collapse is real, but it is the collapse of a specific political order, not the disappearance of a civilization into myth. There is a peculiar habit in popular history of enjoying ruins a little too much. The more vines, the better. The more mysterious, the more satisfying. People love the image of grand stone cities swallowed by forest, as though nature herself had delivered a final verdict on human ambition. The trouble is that this aesthetic pleasure can flatten the actual historical experience. Maya cities were not empty because the jungle won a dramatic duel. They were emptied because maintaining them became increasingly impossible or undesirable under changing conditions. Forest regrowth came later, patiently and without opinion. The real story belongs to human decisions, human suffering, and human adaptation, all of which are more interesting than a postcard of ivy. Excavations at various Maya sites show evidence of incomplete buildings, population shifts, altered diets, and reduced elite consumption. These details matter because they make collapse tangible. A half-finished structure suggests interrupted plans. Fewer imported luxury goods suggest strained trade or declining elite wealth. Changes in household patterns suggest migration or reorganization. Reduced monument carving suggests weakened royal institutions. Archaeology rarely gives us a single clear speech from history. It gives us fragments, broken pottery, pollen, bone chemistry, house foundations, carved dates, burned layers, abandoned terraces. From these, scholars reconstruct not a moment of disappearance, but a long thinning of complexity. One of the more haunting features of the late classic record is the silence of the inscriptions. Maya rulers loved dates. They commemorated events with impressive precision. So when the monuments stop, it is not merely the absence of stone. It is the absence of a worldview publicly reaffirming itself. Time continues, but official timekeeping no longer has a king at the center of it. That is a kind of political death. There may still be families planting fields nearby, but the ceremonial machinery of legitimacy has stalled. For a civilization so invested in ordered cycles, that silence must have felt especially disorienting. There is also evidence that some people may have resisted or bypassed elite systems even before total abandonment. In times of stress, central authority can become less relevant to local survival. Households rely more on kin, local exchange, and practical knowledge than on royal spectacle. This is not the most glamorous part of history, which is precisely why it deserves attention. Civilizations are sustained less by kings than by ordinary people making dinner under difficult circumstances. When those ordinary people begin to decide, collectively though not centrally, that the city is no longer worth supporting, collapse becomes not an apocalypse, but a withdrawal of consent. This may help explain why some major centers seem to have emptied out over time rather than dying in one final violent climax. People left. Some left because of war. Some because of poor harvests. Some because nearby lands became more attractive. Some because elite protection no longer protected much. And once enough people leave, the city's remaining systems become harder to maintain. Reservoirs silt up, causeways deteriorate, palaces decay, workshops close. The city does not just fail its people fail to keep pretending it still works. At this point, we should mention one more old explanation that has mostly fallen out of favor in its simplest form: invasion by outside peoples as the main cause of the collapse. Earlier scholars sometimes sought dramatic external culprits. While migration and outside interactions certainly mattered in Maya history, there is little support for the notion that a single invading force swept through and ended the classic southern lowland world. The evidence points far more strongly toward internal fragmentation compounded by environmental and political stress. Humans are perfectly capable of destabilizing themselves without the courtesy of a neatly labeled outsider. Disease is sometimes suggested as well, but unlike in the post-Columbian era, there is no decisive evidence for a massive epidemic being the central driver of the classic collapse. That does not mean illness played no role. Malnutrition, water stress, and crowding can all worsen health. But disease alone does not currently explain the regional timing and variability, as well as the combined model of drought, warfare, overextended systems, and political breakdown. Historians, as always, prefer a messier explanation because the evidence keeps insisting on one. The northern lowlands offer an instructive contrast. While many southern centers declined, northern sites later flourished, adapting to different environmental and political conditions. Chichen Itza, for example, rose to major prominence in the post-classic period, though its own history is complex and layered. This northern continuity is a reminder that the Maya world reconfigured itself rather than vanishing. Trade routes shifted toward coastal networks. New political models emerged. Religious and artistic traditions changed. The map of power was redrawn, not erased. This is much less satisfying for anyone who prefers one mysterious ending, but better for reality. And reality, quietly, is often less theatrical and more durable. Maya civilization had already existed in various forms for centuries before the 9th century and continued in various forms for centuries after. The collapse was devastating in many areas, especially to elite urban institutions, but it was not the final chapter of Maya history. In some ways, calling it a collapse tells us as much about modern fascination with endings as it does about the past. We like clean narratives, rise, glory, fall. The Maya inconveniently gave us adaptation, dispersal, persistence, and regional variation. It is almost as though real societies refuse to organize themselves around our documentary titles. Imagine, then, a family leaving a once magnificent city. The plazas are quieter than they used to be. A temple still catches the evening light, but fewer people gather below. The ruler's court no longer feels untouchable. The market is thinner. The water is uncertain. Perhaps relatives live farther north or near more dependable resources. So the household packs what it can, leaves behind what it must, and joins the slow current of people reshaping the region one decision at a time. There is no trumpet. No narrator announces the end of an era, just footsteps, children, burdens carried on backs, and the dull understanding that a famous city is no longer where the future lives. From the perspective of archaeology, one of the challenges in understanding the Great Maya collapse is that evidence is uneven. Stone monuments survive better than wooden roofs. Elite tombs survive better than the opinions of farmers. Climate records can suggest drought, but not exactly how one village negotiated its last tolerable dry season. A burned structure may indicate warfare, ritual closure, or later activity. This means every explanation has to be assembled carefully, almost humbly, from incomplete traces. The broad picture is strong, but the fine details remain debated, and probably always will be. History is generous with ruins and stingy with explanations. Still, some patterns are persuasive. In several southern lowland areas, demographic decline coincides broadly with evidence of political fragmentation and severe climatic stress. Monument erection slows or stops. Construction wanes. Settlement densities change. Trade patterns shift. Environmental indicators suggest strain. None of these alone is decisive. Together, they form a compelling portrait of systemic unraveling. It is less like one killer blow and more like a woven fabric losing thread after thread until the whole thing finally gives way. One useful way to think about the collapse is through resilience and brittleness. A resilient society can absorb shocks because its institutions are flexible, its resources are diverse, and its people can adapt without destroying the social order. A brittle society may look magnificent in stable conditions, but prove fragile under stress because too much depends on centralized prestige, narrow ecological margins, or competitive elites. The classic Maya were certainly resilient for centuries. They survived and adapted through many changes. But in some regions by the late Classic, their urban political systems may have become too brittle. Large populations, constant rivalry, elite display, and environmental vulnerability created a world where repeated shocks became harder to absorb. It is the historical equivalent of building a very beautiful house on increasingly uncertain ground. This does not mean Maya elites were foolish. In fact, many responses show ingenuity. Water management systems expanded, agricultural strategies diversified, alliances were formed, rituals intensified, perhaps in part to address crisis. But adaptive measures have limits. A reservoir helps until the drought outlasts it. A stronger wall helps until the surrounding region is unstable. A ritual strengthens legitimacy until repeated failure hollows it out. Human beings are often quite good at solving yesterday's problem and somewhat less good at anticipating the compound effect of 5 problems arriving at once. There is also the question of inequality. In many societies, elites buffer themselves from a crisis longer than commoners do. They maintain ceremony, luxury, and prestige while the wider population absorbs shortages. Archaeological evidence suggests elite households in some Maya centers continued to access more resources than ordinary households, at least for a time. If so, social strain may have deepened not only because conditions worsened, but because suffering was unevenly distributed. People will endure hardship more readily when they believe it is shared and meaningful. They endure it less gracefully when a noble is still commissioning carved stairways while everyone else is counting the remaining maze. One imagines the public mood becoming somewhat less devotional. Some scholars have even suggested that the collapse can be understood partly as a crisis of political ideology. If kings presented themselves as necessary intermediaries between the community and the sacred cosmos, then military defeat, drought, and instability attacked not only their practical authority, but the very ideas that justified it. A ruler who cannot deliver order is not merely unsuccessful, he becomes cosmologically embarrassing. In that sense, collapse was not only material, but conceptual. The system stopped making sense. And once a political order stops making sense to enough people, even stone pyramids begin to look surprisingly mortal. Maya writing helps us here, though imperfectly. Decipherment of Maya glyphs transformed understanding of their history by revealing dynasties, wars, captives, rituals, and personal names. No longer were Maya cities anonymous ceremonial centers inhabited by vague priestly calm. They became recognizably political places full of ambition, rivalry, and historical contingency. This was one of the great scholarly corrections of the 20th century. The Maya were not passive keepers of time. They were active political actors whose cities rose and fell in fierce competition. That makes the collapse more intelligible. It also makes it more human. The famous question, then, is not Why did the Maya disappear? But why did many classic southern lowland polities become unsustainable? This phrasing is less likely to sell souvenir mugs, but it has the advantage of being true. And the answer seems to be that these polities were caught in a convergence of stressors they could not successfully manage indefinitely. Drought reduced the margin for error. Warfare increased insecurity. Political fragmentation undermined coordinated response. Environmental strain limited recovery. Elite legitimacy weakened. Populations moved. Trade shifted. The urban court-centered system thinned, faltered, and in many places ended. This does not mean there were no local recoveries or episodes of persistence. Some cities lingered. Some courts adapted temporarily. Some smaller settlements may even have benefited from the weakening of larger centers. Collapse is never experienced evenly, and historians must resist the temptation to flatten all local histories into a single grand narrative. Yet the broader pattern remains clear enough that the phrase Great Maya Collapse, used carefully, still has value. It names a large-scale transformation in the southern lowlands in which many of the defining features of classic Maya political life came apart. The human cost, though difficult to measure precisely, must have been immense. Food insecurity, displacement, conflict, social upheaval, and the erosion of ritual and political structures would all have shaped lives profoundly. It is one thing to admire the ruins now in filtered sunlight. It is another to imagine the years when the plaster cracked, the water fell short, and the old certainties no longer held. Somewhere in those years, parents still comforted children, people still married, elders still remembered better times, and workers still dragged water home because daily life stubbornly continues even while history rearranges itself around you. Another layer of the story lies in the relationship between city and countryside. Maya cities depended on surrounding rural populations for food, labor, tribute, and support. The countryside, in turn, depended on urban centers for markets, ritual prestige, political protection, and sometimes infrastructure. When the relationship worked, both sides were tied into a functioning system. But when central demands became too heavy or central benefits too unreliable, the connection could fray. This matters because collapse may have begun not only in palaces, but in the weakening bond between rulers and the agricultural base that sustained them. It is possible that, in some regions, rural households became less willing or less able to support elaborate court life. If harvests failed repeatedly, or if war disrupted movement, tribute demands may have become intolerable. Elites may have tried to extract more precisely when people had less to give. That pattern has an extremely long and unenviable history. Once support from the countryside falters, urban centers lose the resource flows that keep monuments rising and courts fed. From the outside, the city appears to collapse. From below, the countryside may simply be refusing to sync with it. Environmental evidence also suggests that some landscapes had been heavily worked by the late Classic period. Pollen records, erosion patterns, and other proxies indicate altered vegetation in some areas, consistent with intensive land use. Again, this should not be simplified into a morality tale about reckless deforestation. The Maya were highly capable environmental managers. But intensive use, combined with drought and political demands, can still produce fragility. One might say the system had become too efficient for its own peace of mind. There was little slack left when conditions worsened. Water in particular seems to have been central. Some southern lowland cities lacked permanent river access and relied on seasonal rains stored in reservoirs and artificial systems. These hydraulic arrangements were impressive and often beautifully integrated into urban design. Yet they also meant that rainfall variability was not a minor inconvenience, but a structural threat. If reservoirs were contaminated, insufficient, or badly replenished, urban life would become harder to sustain. There is even evidence at some sites of water quality problems, which would only deepen the misery. Nothing undermines sacred kingship quite like a failing reservoir and a suspiciously green cup of drinking water. One can imagine the social effect of watching the city's lifeblood shrink season by season. Ceremonies might intensify, offerings might multiply, priests might interpret signs, rulers might sponsor new works to demonstrate control. But practical reality has a way of intruding on ideology. If commoners spend hours fetching poor water while nobles prepare another ritual performance, the emotional economy of the system begins to change. The sacred still matters, but hunger and thirst are persuasive critics. Some researchers have proposed that competition among Maya states may itself have driven overexpansion. Rival rulers sought greater prestige through monumental construction, warfare, and courtly splendor. Success encouraged imitation. If one king raised a grander temple or recorded another victory, neighboring kings needed comparable achievements. This could create a kind of status arms race, expensive to maintain even in good times. Under deteriorating conditions, the same competitive logic that once fueled cultural fluorescence may have accelerated collapse. Magnificence, sadly, is not always a savings plan. It is also striking how many older interpretations of the Maya reflected the assumptions of the scholars who first studied them. 19th and early 20th century observers often romanticized the ruins as a fallen priestly civilization, mysterious and detached from ordinary politics. Later scholarship, using archaeology, epigraphy, and environmental science, restored conflict, complexity, and adaptability to the story. The Maya were not a puzzle because they were unknowable. They were a puzzle because people initially asked the wrong questions. Once researchers stopped asking why a dreamy lost race vanished and started asking how dynamic city-states managed resources, power, and crisis, the picture sharpened considerably. This shift matters beyond Maya studies. It reminds us that collapsed narratives can say as much about modern fears as ancient realities. We tend to project onto the Maya whatever most concerns us: environmental disaster, elite failure, mysterious disappearance, apocalyptic warning, or romantic ruin. The actual Maya story contains pieces of all these, but not in neat moral order. It is less a parable than a case study in how complex societies behave under pressure. If that sounds less dramatic, it is. It is also more useful. There were also spiritual dimensions to the crisis that archaeology can only partially recover. Maya religion infused daily life and kingship, ritual cycles, sacred landscapes, ancestors, and cosmic balance were not abstract extras, but part of how society understood itself. When political and environmental systems falter, belief does not simply vanish. It is reinterpreted, intensified, contested, or redirected. Some communities may have doubled down on ritual obligations. Others may have lost faith in particular rulers while maintaining broader religious traditions. Collapse, then, is not only a matter of abandoned stones, but of changing meanings. The temple still stands, but what people think it does for them may no longer be the same. And that may be one of the saddest dimensions of all. Imagine growing up in a world where your city's monuments were signs of eternal order, where rituals linked your community to divine cycles, where your rulers carved history into stone as if permanence itself had taken sides. Then, over a generation or two, that confidence drains away. The monuments remain, but the order behind them flickers. The king is defeated, the harvest stumbles, the court demands more, and families begin to leave. The city is still physically there, but its promise has gone thin. That is perhaps what collapse often is. Not sudden destruction, but the slow evaporation of collective confidence. By now, we have gathered a fair number of culprits around the dimly lit table. Drought, warfare, environmental strain, political instability, inequality, overextended systems, shifting trade, and weakening legitimacy. The temptation is to ask which one did it. Historians, in their least satisfying but most responsible mood, generally answer that the interaction matters more than ranking a single villain. Drought under stable conditions might be survivable. Warfare in a well-watered and flexible system might be contained. Elite inequality in a prosperous period might be tolerated. But when these pressures overlap, each makes the others harder to manage. A bad harvest fuels unrest. Unrest encourages conflict. Conflict disrupts trade and agriculture. Weak trade hurts elites. Weakened elites lose legitimacy. Lost legitimacy undermines coordinated response. And thus, quite without fanfare, the system begins to sink in several places at once. The phrase systems collapse may sound cold, but it helps explain why even clever and resourceful people can fail to avert disaster. No individual actor controls all the moving parts. One king can sponsor more reservoirs, but not command the rain. One city can fortify itself, but not ensure neighboring stability. One household can store grain, but not restore a broken regional network. People respond rationally within limited horizons, and the aggregate result can still be collective decline. Ancient history is full of this sort of melancholy coordination problem. There is also a chronological nuance worth noting. The collapse was not instantaneous even within the 9th century. Some regions show decline beginning earlier, others later. Some cities experienced political upheaval before major depopulation. Others may have seen gradual demographic thinning. This matters because it suggests not a singular tipping point, but multiple thresholds crossed in different sequences. Think of dominoes, set in separate rooms, connected by hallways rather than touching directly. One set falls first, another later, but the whole house gradually grows quieter. One of the best-known examples is Tikal, a great city in the central lowlands with a long and storied history. Tikal survived earlier rivalries, including dramatic competition with Calakmul, and remained powerful for centuries. Yet, like other great centers, it eventually declined. Monument activity ceased. Population fell. The city was not obliterated in one blow. It waned as though the machinery of greatness had finally become too cumbersome to wind again. Similar stories, with local variations, unfolded across the southern lowlands. Some cities endured longer than expected. Others collapsed with startling speed after political defeat. The pattern is consistent enough to be real and varied enough to resist simplification. Copan in present-day Honduras, offers another revealing case. Famous for its dynastic monuments and artistic refinement, it too saw decline in the late Classic. Evidence there suggests environmental pressure, population density, and political strain may all have mattered. Palenque, admired for its elegant inscriptions and architecture, also did not maintain its classic prominence indefinitely. Each site is a chapter, not a footnote, and each chapter reminds us that even highly accomplished centers can be vulnerable when the conditions supporting them become unstable. Meanwhile, in everyday terms, people kept adjusting. Some households diversified food strategies. Some moved toward wetlands, uplands, or regions with better access to resources. Some likely entered the orbit of rising northern powers. Some communities shrank and simplified rather than disappearing. If the story of kings is one of falling monuments, the story of ordinary people is one of migration, improvisation, and continuity under altered conditions. History tends to shine its spotlight upward, but survival usually happens closer to the ground. This is why the Maya story remains so compelling. It combines grandeur with ordinariness. We see pyramids, astronomy, carved glyphs, and divine kingship. But beneath all that are familiar patterns: environmental dependence, political rivalry, inequality, infrastructure stress, and the hard calculations families make when the future becomes uncertain. It is a story of complexity, and complex stories linger. Also, ruins help. Ruins always help the brand. The jungle itself has played a strange role in how the collapse is imagined. Dense forests conceal and preserve at the same time. Buildings swallowed by roots look mysterious, even when the underlying causes are fairly well researched. Modern technologies like LIDAR have revealed just how extensive Maya settlement and infrastructure were beneath forest cover. Roads, terraces, causeways, fortifications, reservoirs, and vast urban landscapes. Far from a few isolated temple cities, the Maya built intricate human environments on an extraordinary scale. This makes the collapse more impressive in one sense and more understandable in another. Systems of that scale require enormous coordination. When coordination fails, the resulting transformation is correspondingly large. LIDAR has also helped confirm that many Maya centers were embedded in dense settlement networks and heavily modified landscapes. This reinforces the picture of a civilization capable of intense urban and agricultural development, not a loose scattering of ceremonial sites in untouched wilderness. And it sharpens the central question: how does a highly organized regional system lose coherence? The answer, again, seems to lie in multiple stresses operating across interconnected polities whose resilience was wearing thin. Even then, there is humility required. Archaeologists cannot yet narrate every local experience. New excavations continue to change interpretations. Climate models improve. Glyphs are reread. Settlement patterns are revised. The collapse is better understood now than a century ago, but not solved like a puzzle box. And perhaps that is appropriate. Human societies are not equations, no matter how much we would enjoy a neat one before bed. If we step back from the details, the Great Maya Collapse offers a broader lesson about how civilizations end, or rather, how they transform so drastically that later observers call it an ending. They rarely go out in one grand final act. More often, the institutions that once seemed permanent become harder to maintain. Confidence erodes, populations move, and power relocates. The old center does not always die spectacularly. Sometimes it is simply left behind, like a house too expensive, too damaged, or too unlucky to keep repairing. For the Maya, urban ceremonial kingship in many southern lowland centers ceased to be sustainable. That is the heart of it. The reasons were several, mutually reinforcing and unevenly distributed. But the outcome in those regions was unmistakable. Fewer monuments, fewer rulers, less construction, lower populations, and eventually forests reclaiming monumental cores that no longer organized regional life. It is tempting to call this disappearance. It is more accurate to call it reorganization through loss. One should also note that the Maya had experienced rises and falls before. Earlier, centers had expanded and contracted long before the 9th century. Mesoamerican history more broadly is full of shifting centers of power. In that sense, the classic collapse was not an anomaly from outside history, but a particularly dramatic example of patterns already embedded within it. What made it so striking was the scale of urban florescence that preceded it and the relative concentration of decline in key southern lowland regions. When a system has been dazzling, its unraveling appears more shocking. A modest village can decline quietly. A city of pyramids earns a chapter heading, and yet behind the chapter heading are people who probably did not experience themselves as inhabitants of a collapsing civilization. They experienced poor rain, political fear, tribute demands, and the sense that somewhere else might be better. That is often what world historical change feels like from the inside: local, practical, repetitive, and only later recognized as epical. It is entirely possible that many families leaving a declining center did not think they were witnessing the fall of the classic Maya world. They thought they were doing what sensible people do when the city stops working. This should make us cautious with terms like mystery. There are mysteries, certainly. The precise sequence of events differs by site. The weighting of causal factors is debated. But what really happened now has a much better answer than it once did. What happened was not magical disappearance or divine punishment or a civilization forgetting how to exist. What happened was that a network of complex, competitive, environmentally dependent polities in the southern Maya lowlands encountered prolonged stress and, in many areas, ceased to sustain their old political order. That order broke down. People moved, adapted, and continued elsewhere and otherwise. It is, in its own quiet way, a more moving story than the myth of total vanishing. A vanished civilization can be admired and mourned from a distance. A transformed civilization whose descendants remain asks more of us. It asks accuracy. It asks that we distinguish between abandoned palaces and living cultures. It asks that we recognize how much of human history is about survival after the institutions of glory have failed. That, admittedly, is less decorative than a ruined temple postcard. But it is more honest. There is also something humbling in the fact that the Maya left such rich intellectual and artistic achievements despite the fragility of the political systems that sustained many of them. Their calendrical knowledge, writing, mathematics, architecture, and ceremonial traditions were products of societies both brilliant and vulnerable. We tend to imagine brilliance as protection against failure. History rarely agrees. Intelligence can build complexity. It cannot guarantee stability forever. Sometimes it simply produces more elaborate ways to be at risk. Still, it would be wrong to end on fragility alone. persistence matters too. Maya peoples survived the classic collapse, later political upheavals, and then the enormous devastation of European conquest and colonial rule. Maya communities continued to speak Maya languages, maintain traditions, and assert identity in the present. That continuity should stand alongside any discussion of 9th century decline. Otherwise, we risk turning living peoples into scenery for an old catastrophe, which is the sort of thing history should help us avoid. So when we ask what really happened to the ancient Maya, the answer is not that they vanished. It is that many of their great southern lowland cities lost the ecological, political, and ideological conditions that had sustained them. Drought appears to have intensified strain. Warfare fractured alliances and security. Population pressures and land use narrowed margins. Elite systems demanded much and adapted imperfectly. Confidence in divine kingship may have waned. Trade and political networks shifted. Households moved. Centers emptied. New centers rose elsewhere. The old order ended in many places, but Maya life did not. And perhaps that is the sleepiest truth of all. History's great collapses are often not clean endings, but long negotiations with change, carried out by tired people under difficult conditions, while future generations imagine something much neater. The ruins remain, the forest grows, and later observers whisper about mystery. Meanwhile, the past, as usual, was messier, slower, and full of people trying to get through the year. If you were to stand at the edge of a declining Maya city in its final generations as a major center, you might not immediately know that posterity would call it a collapse. You would see temples still standing, though perhaps no new plaster gleamed on their sides. You would hear market sounds, though fewer than before. You might notice less traffic on a causeway, a half-repaired wall, a noble household less crowded than it used to be. You might hear that a neighboring ruler has fallen, that the rains were late again, that another family has gone north, that priests are preparing a ceremony to restore balance. The end of an era, when observed in real time, often looks like maintenance deferred. There is a kind of comfort in this, oddly enough. It reminds us that human worlds do not end all at once for most people. They thin, they loosen, they ask for adjustments. That does not make them less painful. It may make them more so because slow decline requires endurance rather than one dramatic act of courage. The people of the late classic Maya world were not passive extras in a ruined narrative. They were active participants in a drawn-out and uneven transformation, making difficult choices in the shadow of institutions losing their grip. Archaeology lets us glimpse some of those choices. Household remains indicate continued occupation after elite abandonment in certain places. Rural zones show persistence where ceremonial cores fade. Material culture changes in ways that suggest shifting trade and daily practices. Skeletal evidence can hint at diet and stress. Settlement relocation suggests people did not merely perish, they moved. Such evidence is less visually impressive than a carved stela, but it is in many ways more intimate. It brings us closer to the people who lived through the transition rather than the kings who hoped to outlive it in stone. It is tempting, of course, to ask whether the collapse could have been avoided. Could better water management, less warfare, or more flexible politics have changed the outcome? Possibly in some regions, for some time. But counterfactual history has limits. The Maya world was not governed by a single committee that could suddenly adopt best practices after a thoughtful retreat. It was a landscape of competing polities, varied ecologies, and entrenched ideologies. Structural problems are easy to diagnose from 1,000 years away. They are less easy to solve when your rival city is arming, the rain is failing, and your legitimacy depends on appearing cosmically indispensable. This is why the collapse remains compelling, not merely as an ancient event, but as a pattern. It shows how success can create dependency, how political competition can weaken collective resilience, and how environmental stress can expose every hidden crack in a system. None of that is unique to the Maya. It is, if anything, part of the enduring boredom of human history. We build complexity, grow proud of it, ignore its fragilities, and then act surprised when several neglected problems join hands. And yet, even as the southern lowland order broke down, Maya knowledge did not disappear into the leaves. Scripts continued in some contexts, ritual traditions evolved, trade and political organization adapted. The North became more important. People remembered, rebuilt, reoriented. Collapse, then, is not simply destruction, it is also selection. Some institutions fail, others endure, some landscapes empty, others fill. A civilization sheds one form and persists in another. The temples may lose their kings, but the people carry on, which is an annoyingly hopeful habit humans have maintained for quite some time. Later, Europeans encountering Maya ruins often misunderstood them, attributing them to lost races, biblical remnants, or any explanation more convenient than taking indigenous civilization seriously. In that sense, the myth of disappearance has its own history. It reflects colonial habits of imagination in which living indigenous peoples are treated as disconnected from the achievements surrounding them. Modern scholarship has worked hard to correct this, emphasizing continuity and the sophistication of Maya society across centuries. So asking what really happened also means asking who got to tell the story afterward and why they told it badly. There is something satisfying, then, in replacing mystery with complexity. Not because mystery is unwelcome at bedtime, but because complexity is often gentler. It does not demand that we believe in one fatal flaw or one apocalyptic event. It asks us to notice pressure accumulating in many corners at once. It asks us to accept that societies are living systems, not stage plays. And it lets the Maya be what they were: inventive, competitive, devout, political, brilliant, vulnerable, and fully human. By the time many great southern lowland centers were largely abandoned as political capitals, the process had already been unfolding for generations. Children born during the early signs of crisis may have reached old age in a smaller, poorer, or relocated community. What posterity compresses into the collapse could span the emotional weather of entire lifetimes. That, too, is worth remembering. Historical labels are short. Human experiences are not. And so, as the night deepens and the forest edges closer in our imagination, we can leave behind the old picture of the Maya simply vanishing. In its place, we have something more substantial, a civilization whose classic southern lowland political order fractured under intersecting stresses, whose people adapted unevenly, whose culture persisted, and whose descendants remain. The collapse was real, serious, and regionally transformative, but it was not disappearance. It was a long, difficult reconfiguration, written partly in drought, partly in war, partly in stone, and partly in the quiet footsteps of people heading somewhere else. So what really happened? In the calmest possible terms, many of the great southern Maya city-states became unsustainable between the late 8th and 9th centuries because the conditions that upheld them were breaking down together. Rainfall became less reliable in crucial periods. Water systems were strained, agricultural margins narrowed, warfare intensified, political networks fragmented, dynasties lost stability. Elite demands likely pressed hard on ordinary people at exactly the wrong time. Trade shifted. Confidence in sacred kingship may have weakened. Populations dispersed. Monumental urban life dwindled, and through all of this, Maya civilization did what civilization often do when one of their great forms fails. It changed shape rather than ceasing to exist. The grandeur of the classic Maya did not protect it from vulnerability. In some ways, grandeur increased vulnerability by requiring coordination, surplus, and belief on a massive scale. But the endurance of Maya peoples also reminds us that political collapse and cultural survival can happen at the same time. A palace can empty while a language survives. A dynasty can end while a community endures. A city can sink into forest while descendants remember a world the forest never erased. That is perhaps the most useful way to hold the story in mind, not as a vanished civilization, and not as a single neat disaster, but as a layered transformation in which environment, politics, and everyday life intertwined. The great Maya collapse was not one thing. It was many things happening across generations and landscapes until enough of the old order had unraveled that later centuries inherited ruins where capitals had once stood. And now, from a great distance, we look back at those ruins and ask for explanations that fit on a line. History, as always, answers with a tired expression in several paragraphs. The Maya did not disappear. Their classic southern lowland court-centered world fractured. Their cities declined unevenly. Their people adapted, moved, survived, and continued. The mystery is not that this happened, but how long it took us to stop telling the story as though an entire civilization had politely evaporated. For tonight, that may be enough. We have wandered through drought and dynasties, through reservoirs and rival kings, through collapsing legitimacy and stubborn continuity. We have seen that a civilization can be both fragile and enduring, splendid and overburdened, wounded and still alive in its descendants, which, when you think about it, is a very historical sort of outcome. Rarely satisfying, often complicated, and impossible to reduce to one dramatic sentence, no matter how badly people want one. So let the temples remain in the moonlight a little longer. Let the forest press softly around the stones. Let the carved dates fall silent. And let us remember that what ended in the southern Maya lowlands was a particular arrangement of power, prestige, and urban life, not the Maya themselves. The kings lost their cities. The civilization changed its form. The people endured. History filed the paperwork much later.